The world that gives rise to Captain America is built on certainty. Not the certainty of truth, but the certainty of direction. It is a landscape shaped by crisis and urgency, where moral alignment feels obvious because the enemy wears a uniform, the borders are visible, and the cost of hesitation appears catastrophic. In this world, values do not need to argue for their relevance. They are self-evident because survival depends on them. Loyalty is not a choice. It is gravity. This is the soil from which the figure emerges, not as a man seeking purpose, but as a structure designed to hold meaning in place. The body is enhanced, the posture disciplined, the symbol clarified. He is not asked to question the framework that created him. He is asked to embody it. In doing so, he becomes less a participant in history and more a stabilizing force within it, a living anchor meant to prevent drift. At first, the system works. The alignment between value and context is tight. The world is fractured, and clarity is prized over nuance. Sacrifice has a destination. Obedience feels like integrity rather than submission. When Captain America acts, the echo is clean. The shield moves through space with purpose, and the narrative confirms that the center holds. There is no need to doubt the ground beneath his feet, because the ground is reinforced by collective fear and shared resolve. But this world does not remain static. The conflict that justifies the structure begins to dissolve, not through victory alone, but through time. The enemy recedes into memory, institutions expand, and power reorganizes itself behind language rather than banners. The same values remain, but the terrain shifts. The map no longer matches the territory. This is where tension begins, quietly, without spectacle. Not in battle, but in continuity. Captain America is preserved, not only physically but symbolically, carried forward into a world that no longer needs him in the way it once did. The shield still reflects light, but the spotlight has moved. The arena is no longer a battlefield. It is an administrative maze, a media ecosystem, a landscape of indirect control where decisions are made behind glass rather than trenches. He wakes into this environment as a relic that refuses to acknowledge itself as one. The values remain intact. That is the problem. Loyalty that once held the line now presses against structures that have learned to bend without breaking. Integrity that once unified now isolates. The world does not reject him outright. It absorbs him. It smiles. It thanks him for his service. And then it asks him to comply. The figure stands at the center of this system like a monument placed in a city that has outgrown its meaning. The foundation is solid, but the surrounding architecture has changed. What once served as a rallying point now functions as a silent rebuke. His presence exposes something uncomfortable. Not corruption alone, but dissonance. A mismatch between inherited virtue and contemporary power. This is not yet conflict. It is pressure. The kind that builds slowly, invisibly, as expectations accumulate. Captain America is expected to remain what he has always been. Steady, predictable, reliable. He is asked to validate decisions without fully seeing their machinery. To lend his image to outcomes shaped by calculations he would never endorse if they were named plainly. The shield becomes heavier, not because it has changed, but because the meaning attached to it has multiplied. It is no longer just defense. It is endorsement. Silence becomes signal. Presence becomes permission. Around him, the world frames obedience as pragmatism. Ideals are described as outdated, inconvenient, even dangerous in their rigidity. Flexibility is praised. Adaptation is celebrated. The language shifts, not to erase values, but to reposition them. Loyalty is redefined as trust in systems rather than commitment to principles. Unity becomes alignment. Dissent becomes instability. Captain America does not react with rebellion. That would be too simple. He reacts with stillness, a refusal to collapse into the new grammar of power. He listens. He observes. He feels the pressure of expectation bearing down, not as force, but as moral debt. Everything he is has been given to him by a world that now asks him to return the favor by looking away. This is the fracture, not between hero and villain, but between value and context. Between a code built for clarity and a world that thrives on managed ambiguity. The system does not attack him. It reinterprets him. It attempts to turn him into a symbol of continuity while hollowing out the substance that once justified that symbol. In this space, the true conflict begins to take shape. It is not about loyalty to a nation, but loyalty to an internal structure that no longer aligns with external demands. Captain America is not resisting change. He is resisting distortion, the subtle violence of being asked to remain the same, while everything around him insists that the meaning of sameness has changed. The audience senses this before it is articulated. There is unease in the way authority speaks, in the way justifications multiply, in the way the center feels crowded by invisible hands. The hero does not yet act. He waits. The tension accumulates. Because once loyalty outlives its context, it does not disappear. It becomes dangerous, not to power, but to the person who carries it. Captain America is not born from desire. He is produced by necessity. His origin is rooted in a moment when the collective psyche demanded consolidation, a center strong enough to counter fragmentation. The frail body of Steve Rogers matters less than the structure that surrounds him. What is being tested is not strength, but alignment. The experiment does not ask whether he can survive power, but whether power can survive being embodied by someone incapable of bending it for personal gain. The serum amplifies what is already there. This detail is crucial. The transformation is not a reinvention, but an intensification. Courage becomes certainty. Loyalty becomes permanence. Moral intuition becomes a movable axis. He does not acquire complexity through power. He sheds it. Ambiguity is burned away in favor of clarity. In the context that creates him, this is not a flaw. It is the solution. The world he enters is defined by visible threat. Evil announces itself. Lines are drawn openly. In such an environment, values function as weapons. They cut through doubt and coordinate action. Captain America becomes the embodiment of this mechanism. He is not merely fighting an enemy. He is stabilizing meaning. His presence tells others where to stand, what to believe, and why sacrifice is justified. The shield symbolizes this foundation. It is circular, closed, defensive. It does not penetrate. It absorbs. It holds. It reflects. The geometry matters. It represents a worldview that believes stability can be maintained if pressure is properly managed. Conflict is externalized. The interior remains clean. But this architecture depends entirely on context. It assumes that threats come from outside the walls. That corruption wears an opposing flag. That power flows from the center outward in predictable ways. The moment these assumptions fail, the structure begins to strain. When Captain America is displaced in time, the displacement is not merely temporal. It is psychological. He enters a world where power no longer needs to declare itself, where authority disperses across networks rather than occupying thrones, where control operates through normalization rather than force. The enemy is no longer at the gates. It is embedded within the foundation. This new environment does not invalidate his values. It repurposes them. Loyalty becomes a branding asset. Integrity becomes a public relations strategy. Moral language is preserved, but its function shifts. It no longer organizes resistance. It lubricates compliance. Captain America stands out because he does not internalize this shift. His loyalty is pre-institutional. It predates bureaucratic abstraction. He does not trust systems by default. He trusts people and principles. This distinction isolates him. In a world that treats systems as neutral, his skepticism appears naive. In a world that mistakes efficiency for virtue, his refusal to compromise reads as obstruction. This tension is not accidental. It emerges from the way his identity was constructed. Steve Rogers was never trained to navigate symbolic doublespeak. He was shaped to act decisively when values aligned clearly against threat. He lacks the internal tools to rationalize moral erosion because his psyche was never organized around negotiation. It was organized around refusal. That refusal becomes his defining feature. Not refusal to authority, but refusal to reinterpret his own values to fit a corrupted frame. This is where the fracture deepens. The world expects adaptation. He offers consistency. The world demands flexibility. He responds with boundaries. Other figures in the narrative respond differently. They adapt. They integrate complexity. They justify compromise as maturity. They learn to survive within systems by internalizing their logic. This creates a contrast that is not about intelligence or intent, but about psychological orientation. Captain America operates from a center that assumes meaning precedes structure. Others operate from the assumption that structure generates meaning. This difference is subtle but decisive. It determines how loyalty functions. For him, loyalty flows upward toward ideals. For others, it flows laterally toward stability. This divergence is intensified by trauma. The loss of his original world freezes his internal compass. He does not mourn what was lost by reinventing himself. He preserves it intact. Memory becomes territory. The past becomes a reference point that cannot be renegotiated because it represents the last moment when values and action aligned without residue. The world around him, however, has learned to metabolize trauma by forgetting it. History is compressed into narrative. Lessons are extracted and sanitized. Pain becomes content. In such an environment, remembering fully is disruptive. It threatens the smooth operation of the present. Captain America remembers without translation. He does not turn loss into metaphor. He carries it as weight. This makes him resistant to the symbolic economy of the modern world, where suffering is instrumentalized rather than honored. His presence destabilizes those around him not because he accuses them, but because he does not excuse them. He does not need to point out contradictions. He embodies one. The contradiction between values that demand absolutes and systems that depend on ambiguity. The conflict does not arise from ideology alone. It arises from incompatible psychological survival strategies. Captain America survives by holding the line internally. Others survive by bending without breaking. Neither approach is inherently corrupt, but when placed within the same arena, they cannot coexist without friction. This friction is magnified by visibility. Captain America is never just a man. He is a symbol under constant illumination. Every decision he makes reverberates beyond its immediate consequence. Silence is read as consent. Action is read as rebellion. There is no neutral position available to him because neutrality itself has become a political act. The system understands this. It attempts to manage him not through force, but through framing. He is praised publicly and constrained privately. His dissent is acknowledged symbolically and neutralized procedurally. He is invited to participate in decisions whose outcomes have already been determined. This dynamic erodes trust. not because he expects perfection, but because he senses containment. The walls are invisible, but they are present. The arena has changed. It is no longer a battlefield. It is a labyrinth. Captain America does not fear conflict. He fears distortion. He senses that once loyalty is detached from its original context, it becomes a tool rather than a virtue. The moment loyalty serves structure instead of principle, it reverses polarity. It no longer protects. It enforces. This realization does not arrive as insight. It accumulates as pressure. Each compromised mission, each withheld truth, each recalibrated justification. The weight builds. The foundation that once held now begins to crack. Not outwardly, internally. The conflict takes form not through a single rupture, but through accumulation. Small deviations, procedures that feel slightly misaligned, decisions justified by urgency rather than clarity. For Captain America, these moments register as friction rather than outrage. The system still speaks the language of values, but the tone has shifted. Words that once pointed outward now fold back on themselves. Security begins to mean secrecy. Protection begins to mean surveillance. Trust becomes conditional. He is placed within missions framed as necessary compromises. The logic is familiar, the execution is not. Information is withheld for efficiency. Oversight is deferred for speed. Authority is centralized under the promise of stability. None of this announces itself as corruption. It arrives dressed as responsibility. The pressure is subtle but persistent. What unsettles him is not the presence of threat, but the disappearance of consent. Decisions are made upstream and delivered downstream as fait accompli. Accountability disperses across committees and protocols. No single figure stands at the center long enough to be confronted. Power becomes atmospheric, everywhere and nowhere. Captain America senses that his role within this structure has shifted. He is no longer a guardian of the boundary. He is a reinforcement of legitimacy. His presence is used to reassure rather than to resist. When he stands beside an operation, it is read as validation regardless of his internal objections. The shield reflects not only attacks, but narratives. This creates a bind. To act is to endorse. To refuse is to fracture cohesion. Silence is interpreted as agreement. Speech is filtered through institutional channels that soften its edge. The system does not silence him. It absorbs him. The psychological cost of this absorption is cumulative. He is trained to respond to clear threats with decisive action. Here, decisiveness is reframed as recklessness. Restraint is praised. Prudence is elevated as moral maturity. The language positions him as an artifact of a simpler time, respected but gently sidelined. This framing isolates him from peers who have adapted to the new environment. They do not see betrayal. They see evolution. They speak of proportional response, of necessary opacity, of the impossibility of absolute virtue in a complex world. Their arguments are coherent. They are not villains. That is what makes the division sharper. Captain America does not argue back in slogans. He asks questions. Where does this authority originate? Who is accountable when harm occurs? What safeguards exist when trust is violated? The answers are procedural, not moral. They describe mechanisms rather than responsibilities. This deepens the divide. The narrative events that crystallize this tension involve containment rather than confrontation. Individuals are monitored preemptively. Potential threats are neutralized before intent becomes action. The justification is statistical. Risk management replaces judgment. The system claims neutrality, but its reach expands. For Captain America, this represents a reversal of ethical gravity. Action is no longer a response to wrongdoing, but a hedge against possibility. The burden of proof shifts. Innocence becomes provisional. Loyalty to the system requires acceptance of this shift. He refuses to internalize it. Not loudly, not dramatically. He refuses by insisting on presence, by demanding to see, by resisting abstraction. He wants faces, names, consequences. The system resists this demand. Transparency is inconvenient. This insistence marks him as unreliable, not because he is wrong, but because he cannot be predicted. His loyalty is to principles that do not bend with context. This makes him a variable the system cannot fully model. The events escalate when oversight formalizes itself into mandate. Compliance is no longer optional. Registration, monitoring, restriction. The language is clinical. The effect is invasive. Captain America recognizes the pattern not from theory, but from lived memory. He has seen what happens when fear reorganizes society around control. The fracture becomes explicit. He is asked to enforce measures he does not consent to. The request is framed as duty, as continuity, as trust. He experiences it as distortion. The shield that once defended now threatens to become an instrument of coercion. His refusal is not ideological posturing. It is structural. He cannot reconcile loyalty to a system that has decoupled power from consent. To comply would require him to reinterpret his values until they no longer resemble themselves. This refusal has immediate consequences. Alliances strain. Authority responds with concern rather than anger. He is told he is endangering unity, that his stance risks fragmentation. The accusation is precise. Unity has become the highest good. He understands the charge. He also understands its cost. Unity achieved through enforced alignment is not cohesion. It is compression, pressure without release. The public perception shifts. Media environments amplify the divide. Simplified narratives emerge. He is framed as rigid, nostalgic, resistant to progress. Others are framed as pragmatic, responsible, forward-looking. The conflict is translated into archetype, past versus future, idealism versus realism. Captain America does not counter this narrative. He lacks interest in spectacle. His focus remains on the internal consistency of his position. This restraint, however, is misread. In an environment driven by visibility, silence creates vacuum. Others fill it. The system escalates containment. Access is restricted. Decisions are made without his input. He is marginalized politely. This marginalization confirms his suspicion. Power does not tolerate unmanageable loyalty. The first act of open defiance is not violent. It is refusal to comply with an order that violates his internal boundary. The moment is quiet. The consequence is loud. Lines are drawn. The conflict has now taken shape, not as a clash of personalities, but as a structural incompatibility. A value system built for clarity colliding with an order sustained by managed ambiguity. The arena is set. Once the line is crossed, the system reorganizes around it. What had been diffuse tension condenses into polarity. Captain America is no longer a variable within the structure. He becomes a reference point against which positions must be declared. The conflict accelerates not because he escalates, but because neutrality collapses in his presence. Institutions respond by clarifying authority. Jurisdiction tightens. Chains of command become visible where they were previously obscured. What had operated through implication now speaks directly. This shift reveals something essential. The system was never neutral. It was merely unchallenged. His refusal forces it to show its shape. Those aligned with the structure justify their position through necessity. The world is described as fragile, unstable, permanently on the edge of catastrophe. In such a world, hesitation is framed as negligence. Absolute values are depicted as luxuries that only exist in hindsight. The argument is compelling because it appeals to fear rather than malice. Captain America listens. He understands the fear. He does not dismiss it. What he rejects is the conclusion drawn from it. That fear must be managed through preemptive control. That safety requires surrender. That moral cost is acceptable if the outcome appears stable. The polarization sharpens because both sides believe they are preventing collapse. One seeks to contain chaos by expanding authority. The other seeks to contain authority by preserving limits. Each position mirrors the other structurally. Both claim protection. Both claim responsibility. The difference lies in where they locate trust. Narrative events escalate accordingly. Operations once conducted with oversight now proceed unilaterally. Detention replaces dialogue. Classification replaces accountability. Each action is justified retroactively. The present is governed by imagined futures that demand sacrifice now to avoid hypothetical ruin later. Captain America becomes an obstacle to this logic, not because he denies threat, but because he refuses to act on abstraction alone. He insists that power remain answerable to consequence, that force remain visible, that the human cost not be erased by probability. This insistence creates friction on every level. Tactical decisions become ethical standoffs. Each mission carries symbolic weight. If he intervenes, he is accused of undermining authority. If he abstains, he is accused of complicity. There is no clean move left. Every action amplifies the conflict. The system responds by reframing him as unstable. Not dangerous, but unreliable. His refusal to adapt is pathologized as rigidity. His attachment to principle is described as trauma. The past is invoked to explain away the present. This reframing is strategic. It shifts the debate from values to viability. This move is effective because it appears compassionate. It does not attack his character. It diagnoses it. In doing so, it removes his position from the realm of legitimate disagreement. He is no longer opposing policy. He is failing to cope. Captain America recognizes this maneuver instinctively. He has seen how dissent is neutralized without confrontation, by questioning motives rather than arguments, by redirecting attention from structure to psyche. The conflict deepens because the attack is indirect. It targets credibility rather than conviction. The polarization reaches a turning point when enforcement becomes personal. Former allies are tasked with restraint. Bonds built on trust are tested by orders that demand prioritization of structure over relationship. The arena narrows. Choices become immediate. When Captain America acts, it is not to seize power. It is to withdraw consent. He removes himself from the apparatus that demands obedience without accountability. This withdrawal is interpreted as betrayal. The system cannot differentiate between refusal and threat. Anything outside its control appears dangerous by definition. The consequences are swift. He is labeled non-compliant. Operations proceed without him. His access is revoked. The shield becomes a contested symbol. Who does it represent now? Authority or resistance? Continuity or rupture? Public perception fractures along the same lines as institutional loyalty. Some see him as the last barrier against overreach. Others see him as an anachronism obstructing necessary evolution. The conflict is simplified for consumption. Nuance evaporates under repetition. Within the narrative, violence erupts not as intention, but as byproduct. Escalation follows structure, not desire. Once polarization hardens, restraint becomes impossible. Every attempt to restore balance is read as aggression by the opposing side. Captain America does not celebrate defiance. He absorbs its cost. Each confrontation confirms what he already knows. That loyalty without context becomes inertia. That adaptation without boundary becomes erosion. The conflict has passed the point of reconciliation because it is no longer about policy. It is about what kind of order is allowed to exist. The system doubles down. Surveillance intensifies. Control expands. The justification is survival. The effect is compression. Pressure accumulates across the social field. Resistance grows not because people are inspired, but because they feel constrained. Captain America becomes a symbol not by design, but by contrast. His refusal outlines the shape of the cage. His consistency exposes the cost of flexibility. The polarization is complete. The conflict now operates at full structural intensity. The next phase will not be about choosing sides. It will be about consequence. When polarization stabilizes, it stops feeling volatile and starts feeling normal. The conflict no longer announces itself through dramatic rupture. It embeds itself into routine. Procedures adjust. Language hardens. The exceptional becomes operational. What was once debated is now enforced through default settings. This is the most dangerous stage, because resistance begins to look like disruption rather than dissent. Captain America moves through this landscape as a displaced center. He is no longer inside the system, but he is not outside it either. He occupies a frontier space, a contested zone where meaning has not yet been fully claimed. Every action he takes is interpreted symbolically before it is understood practically. His presence bends perception. It forces interpretation. The narrative events that unfold in this phase are shaped by inevitability rather than choice. Enforcement mechanisms collide with lived relationships. Missions designed to neutralize abstract threats intersect with human bonds that refuse abstraction. The system calculates risk. He responds to consequence. These logics cannot synchronize. As pressure escalates, the structure reveals its dependency on compliance. It cannot tolerate principled refusal because refusal exposes contingency. If loyalty is optional, authority must justify itself. If obedience is questioned, legitimacy becomes unstable. The system responds not by correcting itself, but by fortifying its perimeter. Captain America becomes the focal point of this fortification. He is tracked, anticipated, contained, not because he seeks dominance, but because he cannot be predicted within the system's logic. He will not optimize. He will not sacrifice principle for efficiency. This makes him unmanageable. The confrontation that emerges is not a duel. It is a convergence. Multiple lines of tension collapse into a single arena. Former allies face each other not as enemies, but as representatives of incompatible commitments. Each believes they are preventing catastrophe. Each believes the other has already caused it. In these moments, the personal dissolves into the structural. Affection becomes irrelevant. History becomes weaponized. Shared memory is invoked selectively to justify present alignment. Trust erodes not because of betrayal, but because of divergence. They are no longer oriented toward the same center. Captain America does not argue his position. He enacts it. He places his body between force and consequence. He absorbs impact without redirecting it. This is not martyrdom. It is containment. He understands that escalation feeds the system he opposes. His resistance is designed to limit damage, not to win. The cost of this stance is isolation. He cannot fully align with those who seek reform from within, because the structure they accept has already crossed his boundary. He cannot fully align with those who seek collapse, because destruction replicates the same logic of domination he rejects. He remains suspended between extremes. The narrative frames this suspension as weakness, indecision, failure to commit, but psychologically, it represents the last remaining space of integrity, a refusal to let loyalty be repurposed into aggression, a refusal to let values become justification for harm. The system interprets this refusal as threat. It escalates force under the guise of restoration. Every attempt to bring him back into alignment is framed as reconciliation. Every failure is framed as confirmation of his danger. The logic is closed. No new information can enter. Violence becomes unavoidable not because either side desires it, but because the structure requires resolution. Ambiguity must be eliminated. The arena demands outcome. Captain America understands this. He moves not to dominate, but to interrupt. The shield once again becomes central, not as a weapon, but as a boundary. It absorbs the full weight of the system's momentum. It stops forward motion without reversing it. This act is symbolic and literal. It demonstrates that resistance does not need to mirror aggression to be effective. The conflict reaches its apex when the system turns its full apparatus inward. Surveillance saturates space. Control mechanisms tighten. What was justified as temporary becomes permanent. The cost of stability becomes visible. At this point, the narrative no longer centers on Captain America alone. It widens. The effects of polarization ripple outward. Communities fracture. Trust erodes. Fear becomes ambient. The system has secured order at the expense of legitimacy. Captain America's role shifts again. He is no longer resisting policy. He is witnessing consequence. His earlier refusal is reframed by events themselves. What was once dismissed as rigidity now appears prescient, not because he predicted outcomes, but because he understood structure. The conflict does not end in victory. It ends in exposure. The system is revealed as what it is, a structure that confuses control with care, a framework that equates compliance with unity. Captain America does not dismantle it. He survives it. The arena quiets, but the pressure remains. The polarization has left residue. Lines have been drawn that cannot be erased. Loyalty has been tested and redefined. What remains is not resolution, but reckoning. By the time the conflict reaches public consciousness, it no longer belongs to Captain America. It has detached from the figure that revealed it and begun operating as a cultural pattern. What audiences respond to is not a disagreement over policy or authority, but a deeper disturbance in the moral landscape. The story exposes a fault line that had already been forming beneath contemporary myths of governance, security, and progress. The figure of Captain America functions here as a stress test. His values are not extreme. They are deliberately uncomplicated. That simplicity is what makes the fracture visible. When such values become incompatible with the systems meant to embody them, the contradiction cannot be dismissed as fringe. It demands interpretation. Culturally, the conflict resonates because it mirrors a collective experience of disorientation. Many recognize the feeling of being asked to affirm principles while participating in structures that quietly contradict them. The narrative externalizes this experience, turning an abstract unease into a visible struggle between embodiment and administration. The public reaction follows predictable patterns. Identification becomes polarized. Some project onto Captain America the fantasy of moral clarity, untainted by compromise. Others project onto the system the fantasy of rational control, unburdened by sentiment. Each side simplifies the other to stabilize its own position. Complexity becomes intolerable. This process transforms characters into symbols. Captain America is no longer read as a man navigating constraint. He becomes a banner. His opponents are no longer individuals responding to pressure. They become the face of faceless authority. The narrative compresses nuance into archetype because archetype travels more efficiently through cultural channels. Media environments accelerate this compression. Fragments of the conflict circulate stripped of context. Images of defiance and enforcement loop endlessly. Each repetition sharpens emotional alignment and dulls structural understanding. The story becomes a mirror in which audiences see their own anxieties reflected back at them. The symbolic power of the shield intensifies in this environment. It ceases to be a tool within the story and becomes a shorthand outside it. Defense versus aggression, boundary versus expansion, presence versus control. Its circular form suggests completeness, but in the cultural imagination it now marks a limit, a line that should not be crossed. What unsettles audiences is not that Captain America resists authority, but that he does so without proposing an alternative system. He offers no replacement architecture, no blueprint for reform. This absence is often misread as naivety. In reality, it exposes a deeper cultural dependency on structure to generate meaning. The discomfort arises because the narrative refuses to resolve the tension through synthesis. It does not suggest that better management will restore alignment. It suggests that some conflicts are irreducible because they emerge from incompatible orientations toward power itself. This reframes heroism. The hero is no longer the one who secures order. He is the one who reveals its cost. Not through destruction, but through refusal to normalize it. This is a quieter form of heroism, and therefore more disturbing. It offers no catharsis, only clarity. The cultural impact extends beyond the story into how audiences interpret loyalty. Loyalty is no longer framed solely as allegiance to a group or institution. It is re-examined as allegiance to internal coherence. This shift destabilizes inherited narratives of patriotism, duty, and unity. The conflict also exposes how modern systems rely on symbolic figures to legitimize action. Captain America's refusal disrupts this mechanism. Without his endorsement, authority appears naked. This reveals how much power depends not on force, but on reflected virtue. In response, cultural discourse often attempts to rehabilitate the system by reframing the hero. He is described as outdated, inflexible, or emotionally stuck. This pathologization serves a function. It allows audiences to preserve faith in structure by discrediting the mirror held up to it. Yet the persistence of the story suggests this strategy fails. The conflict lingers because it articulates something unresolved in the collective psyche. The tension between safety and freedom, between efficiency and dignity, between adaptation and erosion. Captain America's role as a cultural figure shifts accordingly. He becomes less a symbol of national identity and more a symbol of moral dissonance. He represents the cost of carrying values forward without recalibrating their relationship to power. Not because the values are wrong, but because the world that once justified them has transformed. This transformation resonates across generations. Older audiences may read the story as loss. Younger audiences may read it as exposure. Both responses converge on the same recognition: that inherited ideals do not decay naturally. They are repurposed unless resisted. The narrative thus functions as a cautionary myth, not about authoritarianism alone, but about the subtle violence of alignment, about how easily language of care can mask mechanisms of control, about how loyalty can be inverted without appearing to change. The cultural meaning solidifies around this inversion. The story is no longer about a civil conflict within a fictional universe. It becomes an allegory for modern governance and identity, a reflection of societies struggling to reconcile moral inheritance with structural evolution. The impact persists because the conflict offers no exit. It does not tell audiences how to resolve the tension. It tells them why it will continue. The aftermath of the conflict does not arrive with silence. It arrives with normalization. Structures remain intact. Procedures continue. Language adjusts just enough to acknowledge disruption without absorbing its meaning. The system survives, but it is no longer whole. It carries a fracture that cannot be repaired without confronting what it revealed. Captain America remains, but not as he was. He does not return to a center that has proven unstable. He does not retreat into myth or disappearance. He occupies a marginal space that is neither exile nor authority. This position is uncomfortable by design. It prevents resolution from being mistaken for repair. What has changed most profoundly is not policy or leadership, but perception. The idea that values naturally align with power has been permanently destabilized. The conflict has exposed that alignment as contingent, fragile, and easily manipulated. Once seen, it cannot be unseen. The system adapts by becoming more cautious in its symbolism. It learns that overt invocation of virtue invites scrutiny. Language becomes softer. Appeals to unity become more abstract. Control mechanisms operate further from the spotlight. This is not reform. It is camouflage. Captain America's continued presence prevents full closure. He is no longer an ideal to be replicated, but a measure against which actions are judged. His refusal lingers as an unresolved question. What does loyalty mean when obedience produces harm? What does duty require when structure erodes consent? He does not offer answers. His legacy is not instruction. It is constraint. He limits how far rationalization can go without being challenged. He embodies a boundary that cannot be legislated away because it exists prior to law. Culturally, this boundary persists as unease. The story resists nostalgic containment. It cannot be comfortably archived as a tale of necessary conflict resolved by compromise. Its power lies in what it withholds. It denies the audience the reassurance that balance can always be restored through negotiation. Instead, it leaves behind a residue of vigilance, a recognition that systems do not drift toward justice by default, that values do not survive through repetition alone, that loyalty requires constant interrogation of the structures it serves. Captain America's legacy thus functions less as inspiration and more as interruption. He interrupts the fantasy that complexity absolves responsibility. He interrupts the belief that survival justifies erosion. He interrupts the comfort of moral delegation. In the final accounting, he does not stand as a victor. He stands as a reminder of a time when values and context aligned cleanly, and of the cost of carrying those values into a world that has learned to weaponize them. The conflict does not end because it cannot. It is not a problem to be solved, but a condition to be recognized. Loyalty, once detached from its originating context, becomes either empty ritual or quiet resistance. Captain America chooses the latter. That choice leaves him isolated, respected, misunderstood, and necessary. The world moves on. The pressure remains. So does the line he refused to cross.